Well, I'm so glad to be here with you on this snowy day, as everybody has commented on. And thank you, Nancy, for inviting me to do this. I appreciate that. I've been doing research for the last 18 years at Gordon-Conwell, and I'm going to share a little bit of it with you. So here we go. My title is Suicidal Christians and How to Help Them. And you might be sitting there saying, Suicidal Christians in church? Are you kidding me? We're too blessed to be depressed, right? So how can this be? And I have to tell you, at one point in time, I would have agreed with you. But I'm a psychologist. I had clients who were Christians who go to church, who came to me around suicidal thinking. I've had pastors as clients who were suicidal. I have talked to many research participants who go to church regularly who are suicidal. I've had friends who are suicidal. And so sort of the weight of all of that data has made me think, oh my goodness, these people, suicidal people, are in our churches. And the question I keep having is, how are we helping these folks? How are we ministering to the suicidal Christians who are in our churches? So one of the things I'll share with you is that by the way, I've done all of this research with wonderful Mako students. Glad to see Mako students in the audience. And one of the studies that we did, we actually asked 745 Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant congregants all kinds of questions about their experience in churches. But I have to tell you, 11.41% of those folks had current suicidal thinking. Now, that doesn't mean 11% of all of your churches have suicidal thinking, but 11% of those folks who are currently going to churches had current suicidal thinking. So anyway, the question I've been asking myself is, how do we help these folks, right? How do we as a church help these people? Now, one of the other things that we found in our research is, and this was a large study with clergy, right? 801 Catholic, Jewish, Protestant clergy. What we found out was about one suicidal person reaches out to their pastor or rabbi or priest per year. Maybe on average 2 contacts per year. So one of the things that has been going through my mind about this is, oh my goodness, are these people getting the ministry that they need? And the second question is, why are they not reaching out for help? Why are not more of these people reaching out for help? So one of the things that I've been finding out is that suicidal Christians are concerned about the possibility of stigma, right? So I asked a whole bunch of people, like, what kind of stigma do you run into? Well, only weak Christians become suicidal. So if that's the thinking that they're having, they might feel concerned about reaching out for help, right? They feel like this might be a failure of their faith, and they have to put on a facade when they go to church of having it all together, right? So now that's my argument for why we need to talk about how to help these people. So now I'm going to tell you how to help them. So hopefully I've convinced you we have suicidal Christians in our churches. So let me give you some ideas. After 18 years of research on this, I have lots of ideas. If you want to really hear all of them, I teach a 1-week intensive in June, so you could go hear about all of my ideas and all the ideas that my wonderful students have helped me with. But let me give you a few important ones, because one of the things I think that we might feel like as Christians in churches is, but how do I help these people? How do I come alongside these people who are struggling, who are, in fact, maybe not getting the ministry that they would like to get from our churches? All right, so here's one idea. One idea is that I've heard a lot about this idea of transparent authenticity, that not just suicidal Christians, but I think all of us in churches, would like to have this feeling that we can bring all of ourselves to church. So here's a few quotes. So one pastor I spoke with said, people they don't want to have to present their shiny, pretty selves in church. What they want to do is show up in church, warts and all. All right, so that's a quote from a pastor who was talking about this notion of transparent authenticity, right? And by the way, I think some churches really do a nice job of creating this transparent authenticity to their congregation, right? They build I've talked to many suicidal Christians, and they talk about how the faith leader really builds this culture in the church where people can, in fact, bring not just suicidal thinking, but all kinds of struggles that people have, right? And suicidal thinking is just one of the struggles that Christians have. There are so many, right? They struggle with, oh my goodness, my finances are in a shambles, or I'm struggling with my parenting, or whatever it is, right? They want to be able to bring these issues. And one of the things that churches do, who are in fact ministering to suicidal congregants and other folks who are struggling, is that they create these situations where people are actually able to share these issues in church kind of settings. So this is a long quote, but I love this quote from one of the research participants who said that when we ask for prayer in churches or in our small groups, we're actually practicing that authentic transparency, that transparent authenticity, and that just plain old asking for prayer sets that tone of people being able to reach out for help for any number of issues. All right, so this is the quote. This is a research participant who said, asking for prayer shows a layer of vulnerability, a layer of honesty. I think it shows that we're not hiding things from each other, like everything's perfect. When people ask for prayer, it's one step towards showing people, hey, I'm not perfect, and we still support them and accept them. And I think that's such an important thing that we do in churches that are going to be important for supporting suicidal Christians, as well as Christians who struggle with a whole number of issues, right? I think that I call these naturally occurring protections for suicidal Christians. I think that's a naturally occurring protection that many churches offer to people who are struggling. But there are some non-naturally occurring pieces, I think, that can help protect against suicide in churches. And one of them is going to be mentioning the word suicide at some point in your church. I remember the first time my church did it. I'm looking for Jay back there. I don't know if you remember, Jay, but I remember the first time our church prayed for people who had been touched by suicide. It was like electric for me. Like I just felt like something so important had just happened. And for me, I think that's a non-naturally occurring protection for suicidal Christians, because it says, hey, you know what? We're willing to have that conversation with you. And I think that is a non-naturally occurring protection that we can add to our churches, even if we have that transparent authenticity. Now, this is another study that, by the way, lots more students, just couldn't fit them up on the page right there. But I'm going to tell you about some of those other some of those protective factors that help prevent suicide in faith communities and churches, all right? But one of them is that safe, connected community, right? And in order for it to be safe, somehow we have to confront that stigma that Christians are meant to show up all put together, right? Somehow we have to confront that stigma. So that would be the first one, all right? The second one and this is something that all of us can do to help support suicidal Christians. The second one is that one of the things that's true in the literature, but certainly has been true in all the research that I've done with my students, is that faith leaders, pastors, priests, rabbis, whoever you want to talk about, are undertrained when it comes to trying to help somebody who's suicidal, all right? They're just undertrained. And so what suicidal Christians have said to me is, if you want to get help at a church, it's hit and miss. All right, so some churches are going to be able to help you, and some churches are not going to be able to help you, because this is a non-naturally occurring protection. There's something that faith leaders and congregations have to do in order to be helpful to suicidal Christians. All right, let me give you a quote. This is not Gordon-Conwell, I just want you to know. But this is a quote from one of those 801 clergy, so I don't know who it was because it was a confidential survey, right? But this is a quote from one of the participants who said, "The counseling courses I took for my MDiv were entirely without doubt lacking any substance, actual training, or real merit." Boy, that's not much of a supportive statement, is it? We were told to refer, and that's all. And while I agree that I'm not trained to serve as someone's therapist or psychiatrist, I am too often the first person they come to when fighting depression or suicide. There's a lot of research to support that. Yeah, I'm a psychologist. They're not going to come talk to me. They're going to go talk to their pastor. The question is, will the pastor be ready to be helpful to this suicidal Christian, right? Now, by the way, I think Gordon-Conwell does a better job than that. So that's the good news. All right, but I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to do this, how to help a suicidal person. So I grew up in France. My parents were missionaries. So I'm always dreaming about going to France. Like that's just always there. It's always there. All right, so what I want to ask you to figure out is, at what point in time do you think I'm going to actually go to France? All right? So, I'm always dreaming. It's always in the back of my mind. Sometimes, though, I'll actually say, you know what? I'm going to go next summer. I'm going to go next summer to France. All right? But at the same time, I'm probably not going to actually go to France until I actually buy those tickets. All right? So at what point am I actually going to go to France? Probably not until I actually make the plan and buy the tickets. Same thing with suicide. I'm not actually going to follow through on those suicidal thoughts that I have until I make a plan and actually plan for how I'm going to actually follow through on those plans. All right? So what I'm trying to figure out as a psychologist, or by the way, I've had to do this as a friend. I've had to do it for people in church, in my church, right? The way I have to do it, and everybody has to do it, is you have to literally ask the person, where are you on this continuum, right? Have you thought about how you would take your life? Have you put together the means to be able to follow through on that particular plan? Now, if you're like me a few years ago, you would say to yourself, well, that's the last thing in the whole world I'm ever going to ask anybody. But here's the thing. There's tons of research that says asking someone about their suicidal thinking isn't going to create more distress. It's not going to plant the idea in their mind. It doesn't increase the suicidal risk. The only way to figure out where they are on that continuum is to ask them. So here's my, I've been in the mental health world for 32 years or more. So here's how I think about it. I think about it like this. Here's this suicidal person going through life saying to themselves, oh my goodness, I've never wanted to have suicidal thoughts. I'm so confused by them. I'm puzzled. I don't know what to do about them. And here comes somebody who says, are you having suicidal thoughts? It's almost a sense of relief. Like, oh my goodness, here's finally somebody who's willing to talk to me about this, right? And that's why asking does not contribute to suicide risk, but in fact can help you figure out, hey, what are we going to do to be able to help you? And I'm going to choose some words from Deuteronomy. How can we help you choose life, right? Despite the fact that you're also pulled towards death. Now, that's the basics. What I want to say is when I first started in this field many years ago, there were no religious Christian trainings on how to do suicide prevention. Look at all of them. There's lots of them to pick from. Now, in 2024, we just have a lot of suicide prevention training from a Christian perspective that we can pick from. Now, the other thing I just want to say, because I want to give you some really concrete ideas here about how to help people in your congregation. The other thing is I want to share with you a study that was done by a psychiatrist named Jerome Motto, who followed 3,000 people who had been discharged from the hospital, either because of depression or because of a suicidal crisis. And he followed three groups: people who didn't want help, people who wanted help, and people who didn't want help, but the hospital sent them a letter anyway. Dear Joe, Jane, how are you doing? Send us a letter back if you want, and we'll respond. That's all it said. Those were the people that did the best. Those were the people that had the lowest suicide rate. And you know the thing that has struck me about that research study? That's what churches do. Churches send letters to people all the time. Why not send a letter to people that we know are struggling with either depression, and we might not even know, does that depression translate into suicidal thinking? But why not just send them a letter? Dear Joe, dear Jane, hey, we haven't seen you in a while. Hope you're doing okay. Send us back a note if you'd like. Now, and they've replicated that study with texts, with phone calls, with visits, in all kinds of ways. So this is low-hanging fruit for us, right? Now, the other thing that's important is just to know what to do. So let's say we have less stigma. Suicidal Christians reach out for help. We have to figure out what we're going to do. And we have to figure out what we're going to refer them to help them, right? Now, one of the things everybody in the United States needs to know about is 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Anybody can call it at any point in time and just say, hey, I'm a little confused. I have a friend who blah, blah, blah is struggling. What should I do to help? That's anybody in this room can call 988 and get some support. But at the same time, let's say you do have a friend or a congregant at your church who's struggling. You can reach out, you can bring that person to a hospital emergency department, you can reach out to a mental health professional, right? So there's lots of ways that you can connect this person up with resources. Now, a few other things I want to say is that suicidal congregants, when I've talked to them, suicidal Christians, they bring their faith into their struggles, of course, right? And I think it's really important for us to recognize that, but also for our churches to do that kind of teaching regularly, right? So one of them is just plain old the dignity of every human, even humans who struggle. Even humans who struggle have dignity and worth, right? So I think that's one of the things that's so important. The other one is, this is a fancy-dancy word that comes out of Marsha Linehan, the DBT kind of group. She calls these moral objections to suicide. I've had a lot of secular colleagues who have taken issue with that particular wording, so I just call this stuff life-affirming teaching. That's pretty much what it is. But why is it that Christians should stay alive even in limiting circumstances? Christians who are struggling with something challenging, like maybe ALS, why should they stay alive, right? I think it's our job as churches to figure that out and to talk about it. I can tell you, I've talked to many pastors, many suicidal Christians, and they talk about the sanctity of life, that it's God who puts to death, it's God who brings to life. The other is hope. I think my favorite verse in the Bible is from Genesis 50, where Joseph says, hey, he says, slavery is bad, by the way, and it's evil, and you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. We've just all come through Easter. God is a redeeming God, and I think suicidal Christians need to be able to hang on to that. Well, you can tell that's a touching verse for me. That is so important. But I think what faith gives to suicidal Christians is reasons to live, right? And so we need to be faithful teachers of the gospel, faithful teachers of God's word for suicidal Christians who are struggling with trying to find what are those reasons to live. And they're there. They're there in the faith that suicidal Christians so desperately are trying to hang on to. Now, I think these are naturally occurring. I think we in churches, we may not mention the word suicide, and I have to tell you, I have heard many sermons and devotions on Acts 16, and I keep waiting for the word suicide. Like, say the word suicide. The Philippian jailer was trying to kill himself, right? But I love that in this narrative, right, that the jail, so Paul and Silas are in prison in Philippi, there's an earthquake, the prisoners are free, the jailer wakes up, he sees the prison doors open, he draws his sword, he's about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped, and Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself." To me, that is an incredible statement of the worth and dignity of absolutely every human, even a jailer, who probably was a little bit, I'm assuming, a little bit of a scumbag kind of a person who probably didn't treat Paul and Silas very well. And yet Paul saves his life. That to me, that screams just this important teaching of the Bible of the worth and dignity of absolutely every human being. Now, the other thing that we have found that's so important for suicidal Christians is worship. It's in worship that suicidal Christians are able to, on some level, stand apart from their suffering, right? One pastor said, worship stops the hamster brain. It gives me a day to think of something other than whatever is hamstering around in my brain. And I think it's the rhythms, not only the rhythms of every Sunday, but the rhythms of every week, the rhythms across a whole year, that is so meaningful to suffering congregants, to suffering Christians. That's an anchor. That worship is an anchor for people who are suffering. So making sure, writing those letters, making sure these people are coming to church, right? And having the opportunity to experience that in churches. Now, the other thing that we have found is that suicidal Christians really think of this as very intertwined. It's a culture. It's not a program. So we're not saying, you know what, you ought to start a suicide prevention program in your church. This is about a culture, right? It's about setting the tone for authentic transparency, but at the same time doing some of those things that have to be done that are non-naturally occurring, which is planning for how are we going to help suicidal congregants when they do reach out for help, right? So one of the things that I love this quote from a person who runs the Lutheran Foundation in Fort Wayne, Indiana, who said to me, nothing happens in a church without a pastor's support. But I can tell you, nothing happens if the pastor is left to be the only responsible one. All right, so we all have a part to play in suicide prevention in our churches. And I'd just like for you to think about what's one of the things that I mentioned today that you might be willing to remember and follow up on. So I'm going to give you a second. Think about it. What's one thing you might be willing to follow up on? I gave you lots of ideas. Pick one. And I say it out of concern for our brothers and sisters who struggle and might not, in fact, get the ministry from the church that they need to be getting. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.